Today, we are living through what can be considered a new golden age of JRPGs, with new titles being released constantly, be it from famous franchises that kept the genre alive throughout the worst moments, or even with new IPs being so recognized to the point of being nominated for Game of the Year. And the best part? They are all being localized in many languages and released in the West. However, if you're about my age, you know that it wasn't always like this. Even during the times when JRPGs were at the peak of their popularity, being released in the West was always a gamble, even for the most famous franchises. And today I'm gonna talk exactly about these franchises and tell you if they became fully available officially in the West or not. Starting with Is. The adventures of Redhead Adol Christian conquered its place in the West slowly. The first games in the franchise actually did get released here, but among many new titles, ports and re-releases, the series would only be back on this side of the world with its sixth game, Arc of Nepotism? I have no idea how to pronounce that, sorry. Even with a few changes in its visuals to make it look less Japanese, a rather common and unfortunate practice in the past. This game had a cult following, but didn't really become as popular as other franchises. During the next years, the series had a shy appearance in the West every now and then, mainly through Steam releases, with the pack including the remix Ys and 2, the prequel Ys Origin, Orphan Felgana, which is a remake of Ys 3 and received a new port from other consoles recently, and once again Ys 6, the Arc of Netpeace. Meanwhile, PSP received the seventh game in the series, creatively named Ys 7. Made with a new engine and featuring a new combat and party system, that continued through Ys Memories of Celceta for the PS Vita. All of this sparked more and more interest in the franchise in the West, but I think it's safe to say that it was only when Ys 8 Lacrimosa of Dana was released that it finally reached a safe place in terms of popularity, guaranteeing that we would keep receiving every new game in the series in this side of the world. Now, for the final question. Is the series entirely available through official means in the West as of 2025? The answer is no. Even though we got ports and remakes of the older games and the most recent games localized, there is still one single entry in the main series that didn't get an official localization, which is Ys 5 Lost Caffeine Kingdom of Sand, released for the SNES and with a remake for PS2. The only way to play it in English is still through a fan translation, and as far as I remember, it's only available for the SNES version, so if you wanna play the PS2 remake, you have to play it in Japanese. Sad, but I hope we live to see a localized remake of this game in the future. Dragon Quest. If the JRPG genre was a village and the games were NPCs, Dragon Quest would surely be the village elder. Being one of the most adored franchises ever, now it has its place in the West and with a huge fan base, but it wasn't always like this. Back in the early days, when Dragon Quest was still called Dragon Warrior in the West, it was a very niche game. A well-beloved niche game, but still a niche game. To the point that after Dragon Warrior 4 on the NES, the West would skip Dragon Quest 5 and 6 on the SNES, only to see a Dragon Warrior game again on the PS1 with Dragon Warrior 7, and only to be met with cold reception and mixed criticism. Even today, Dragon Warrior 7 is still one of the most divisive entries in the series. Later on, the next installment in the series would drop the Dragon Warrior name and start being published with the same name as the Japanese version. Dragon Quest VIII was released on the PS2 and became a success among fans of the genre in the West. Meanwhile, little by little, Square Enix started releasing remakes of every entry in the series for DS, 3DS and mobile, and localizing each one of them, conquering its well-deserved popularity in the West until Dragon Quest XI finally arrived in 2017 as a huge success among fans and critics alike. Now, even spin-offs like Dragon Quest Monsters, Heroes and Builders have their own place guarantee on this side of the world. And now for the final question. Is the series entirely available through official means in the West as of 2025? And no. Even though the older games were remade and localized, there is still one single entry in the series that remains exclusive to Japan, and that would be Dragon Quest X, which is actually an MMO. And as if it wasn't enough, even the offline version of Dragon Quest X wasn't localized, and that, in my point of view, is completely unexcusable. Why, Square Enix? Why? Tales of. This one's a mess. It's hard to imagine it now that we have every new Tales of localized and they're even receiving awards in the West, But back in the SNES, PS1 and PS2 era, all we could do was sit and pray that Namco would hear our voices and bring these games in English to us. Right off the bat, the first game, Tales of Phantasia on the SNES, wasn't localized until it was ported, and terribly ported, to Game Boy Advance. On the PS1 we got both games, Tales of Destiny and Tales of Eternia, which was rebranded as Tales of Destiny 2 during that time. However, as we proceeded to the next generation, we never knew which ones would be released. Actually, there was more or less of a pattern. If the game was 3D, there were chances it would be released, as was the case of Tales of Legendia and Abyss. If it was 2D, probably not. And that's why we missed some fun favorites like Destiny Remake, Rebirth and Destiny 2, the real Destiny 2, actual sequel to Tales of Destiny that was released on the PS2. However, later on, even some 3D titles like the DS releases Tales of the Tempest and Tales of Innocence would also be skipped in the West. We even had some strange happenings like Tales of Vesperia being localized for the Xbox 360, but then getting a definitive edition for the PS3 that would be exclusive to Japan for years, until being released again for the next generation. Nowadays, however, Bandai Namco seems much more confident on publishing the series in the West, and they already declared that they are interested in remastering and porting many of their older titles. Let's hope that this includes the ones they skipped in the past. And that leads us to the main question here. Is the series entirely available through official means in the West as of 2025? Nope. As I said, many of the older Tales of games are still Japan exclusive, especially the PS2 2D titles. Luckily, almost 2 decades later, there are fun translations for these games being released, so we can at least count on this to be able to play them in English. Shin Megami Tensei. Once again, with the massive popularity the Persona series brought to Shin Megami Tensei, it's hard to imagine how the franchise struggled in the past. Especially being such a huge franchise with tons of different games and spin-offs, it took decades for them to start being properly released here. And by properly I mean not only released but also not completely butchered like the first Persona, which had all of their character portraits edited to look less Japanese, every name changed to something more English sounding, including the names of places, and a whole storyline cut out of the game. There's a lot of reasons mentioned for the entire series not being released back then, besides being so Japanese. From sensitive mature themes, religion, to the complexity of the storyline, difficulty of the gameplay itself, and many other things. And let's be honest here, most publishers back then used to underestimate Western people capacities. So many things happened with this series that I can't stop thinking about more and more things to say here beyond what I already said, like, for example, during the time they released the first Persona here, there was an attempt to brand the series with the name Revelation instead of Shin Megami Tensei, or even a direct translation of the name that means New Reincarnation of the Goddess. Meaning that the first Persona was actually named Revelations Persona, and we even had another SMT spin-off released for the Game Boy called Last Bible, that was renamed Revelations the Demon Slayer. This idea was dropped relatively soon, and after skipping Persona 2 Innocent Sin, Persona 2 Eternal Punishment was properly localized and released in the West. But it was only after Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne was localized that we finally had the chance to show that yes, people from the West can also enjoy hardcore turn-based games and can deal, somewhat, with complex themes like religion and demons. Thankfully, after the series became a success, every subsequent SMT game was localized and published here. Now, for the main question once again. Is the series entirely available through official means in the West as of 2025? Nope, not at all. Most older games and spin-offs still remain Japan exclusive to this day, and with no expectations for remasters or remakes anytime soon. And to make things worse, some of them doesn't even have fun translations, leaving us to learn Japanese if we really want to play them. Fire Emblem. Now a beloved franchise for Nintendo JRPG fans and one of the main representatives of tactical strategy RPGs. It wasn't always like that in the West, since this series was Japan exclusive for literally generations. The first 6 games of the franchise, released through multiple consoles including the NES, SNES and Game Boy Advance, were kept only to Japanese audience. Possibly another case of game too complex for Western audiences. It was only on the 7th game in the series in 2003 that we finally had the chance to play Fire Emblem in this side of the world. As such, the game called Fire Emblem Rekka no Ken was released simply as Fire Emblem here. Since there were no other Fire Emblems released before, there was no need for a subtitle, I guess. The fact that this entry featured a more extensive tutorial and was actually a prequel of Fire Emblem 6 rather than a sequel made this the perfect choice to try to appeal to a new audience. And it worked! With each new installment in the series, it started to grow more and more popular, and more fanservice-esque too. But that's another story. Even so, the Western releases were somewhat unstable since one of the games on the Nintendo DS, the remake for Fire Emblem 3 specifically, stayed only in Japan. It was only when Fire Emblem Awakening came out on the 3DS that the series was officially firmed as a success in the West, and we finally started seeing every new entry being released here, including Pet Your Waifu minigames and dubious clothing DLCs. After reaching this level of popularity, have the series become entirely available in the West as of 2025? Once again, no. Some of the older entries remain Japan exclusive and only accessible through fan translations. Even though Nintendo released remakes for the first 3 games, only the remakes of 1 and 2 were localized, meaning that every game from 3 to 6 still needs to be played through unofficial means if you want to play them in English. Final Fantasy. Yes, the great colossus of the genre. If it was hard to imagine that the previous franchise struggled to be released in the West, this one's almost impossible, but it did. If you're around my age or older and lived through the NES and SNES era, aka before the phenomena that Final Fantasy VII started, you lived through the struggles of this franchise. Even today, sometimes I still find people that are a little confused with the first games in the series and their numbers. You see, the first Final Fantasy was released in the West, but Final Fantasy II and III were not. However, when Final Fantasy IV came out on the SNES, it was localized and released in the West, and since the only Final Fantasy available here back then was the first one, they renamed it as Final Fantasy II. After all, it was the second Final Fantasy to be released here. It made sense. Maybe. That wouldn't stop there, since Final Fantasy V was released in Japan and only in Japan, again, but then Final Fantasy VI appeared and was localized, as Final Fantasy III. Even to this day there are people who call Final Fantasy IV and VI by their old names, Final Fantasy II and III respectively. Thankfully, when Final Fantasy VII finally was released on the PS1, Squaresoft decided to throw away everything that happened before and call it Final Fantasy VII, as it should, but leaving behind a hole in the series numbers. Eventually, they would release all of the other games in the West through ports and remakes, including versions for PS1, Game Boy Advance, PSP, 3D remakes for DS, and that leads us to our question. Is the series entirely available through official means in the West as of 2025? Actually, yes, it is. Unlike the other series I mentioned here, Final Fantasy is available entirely in the West, MMOs included and everything. The only exception would be the pixel version of Final Fantasy III, since for years we only had access to the 3D remake, but we finally got it through the Pixel Remastered edition. Meaning that we can now play every game in the franchise localized through official means, and even in many languages other than English. Amazing, huh? So, as you have seen, life for JRPG fans in the past wasn't easy at all. We had many good games, yes, and good games were released one after another. But even so, there was always a dark shadow in the horizon, which was the chance of those good games never being localized, and leaving us, the fans, waiting for literal decades until the release of a remake or a fan translation. That said, we finally got what we always wished for, and seeing all these new titles being released practically simultaneously all of the time is reason enough to be thankful that some things have changed over time. And what about you? Was there any game that you really wanted to play but was never released in your region? Which one? Tell us all about it in the comments. And thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Till next time!